A blood debt that couldn't be paid. Bianca Marchesi had spent a decade playing the role of the perfect mafia wife. Obedient, beautiful, silent. But when her husband was assassinated, she did not mourn. She planned. The men in her world saw her as weak, a relic of a marriage built on politics and power. All except for him. The man who had once been her husband's most loyal enforcer. The man who had always looked at her like he knew exactly what she was capable of. "Tell me, Bella mia," he murmured, stepping closer. "Do you want justice or revenge?" Chapter 1. The stillness after the storm. The air in the villa was thick with the scent of lilies and the lingering ghost of expensive cigars. It was the kind of stillness that followed a hurricane, a deceptive calm that Bianca Marchesi knew wouldn't last. The funeral had been 3 days ago, a grand, ostentatious affair befitting a man of Lorenzo Marchesi's stature. Or, rather, a man of his reputation. Mafia Don. Husband. Tyrant. All titles he'd worn with a chilling ease. Now, he was just a cold body in an ornate casket, leaving behind a void that Bianca was surprisingly eager to fill, not with grief, but with a simmering, carefully cultivated rage. She stood on the balcony, overlooking the sprawling gardens that stretched down to the shimmering Mediterranean. The sun was setting, painting the sky in hues of bruised purple and fiery orange, a violent beauty that mirrored the turmoil within her. The sea breeze, usually a comfort, felt like a taunt, whispering of freedom she'd been denied for far too long. 10 years. 10 years she'd spent playing the role of the dutiful wife, the silent ornament on Lorenzo's arm. 10 years of swallowing her pride, her opinions, her very self. Bianca traced the intricate pattern of the wrought iron railing, the cold metal a stark contrast to the warmth of her skin. She'd been a young woman when she'd married Lorenzo, barely 22, fresh out of a convent school, chosen for her beauty and her family's connections. Her father, a lesser figure in the intricate web of the Sicilian underworld, had seen the marriage as an opportunity, a stepping stone to greater influence. Bianca had seen it as a gilded cage. She'd learned quickly. Learned to smile when she wanted to scream, to nod when she wanted to argue, to be seen and not heard. She'd mastered the art of the vacant gaze, the politely empty smile, the perfectly timed, meaningless compliment. She'd become a phantom in her own life, a ghost haunting the opulent halls of the Marchesi villa. But Lorenzo was gone, and the phantom was ready to become flesh and blood again. Inside, the house was filled with the hushed murmurs of family and associates. The vultures, Bianca thought with a flicker of dark amusement, circling, assessing, waiting to see who would rise from the ashes of Lorenzo's empire. They underestimated her. They all did. They saw the perfectly coiffed hair, the elegant dresses, the carefully cultivated mask of serene indifference. They saw a grieving widow, a fragile flower to be pitted, perhaps even controlled. They didn't see the steel in her spine, the fire in her eyes, the years of pent-up fury that were about to be unleashed. A soft cough broke her reverie. She turned, her movements fluid and graceful, years of practice making even the simplest gesture a performance. Standing in the doorway was Alessandro Rossi, Lorenzo's second-in-command, his most trusted enforcer. He was a man of imposing presence, tall and broad-shouldered, with a face that seemed carved from granite. His eyes, however, were what held Bianca's attention. Dark, intense, and surprisingly knowing. They were the eyes of a man who had seen too much, who understood the darkness that lurked beneath the surface of their world. He was also the only man who had ever truly seen her. Not the facade, but the woman beneath. "Signora Marchesi," he said, his voice a low rumble that sent a shiver down her spine. It wasn't fear, not entirely. There was a current of something else, something that had been simmering between them for years, unspoken, unacknowledged, but undeniably present. "Alessandro," she replied, her voice steady, betraying none of the turmoil within. "I was just admiring the view." He stepped onto the balcony, the subtle scent of his cologne something dark and woody, with a hint of citrus reaching her. He stood beside her, not too close, but close enough that she could feel the heat radiating from his body. It was a subtle assertion of power, a reminder of his position, but Bianca didn't flinch. "It's a beautiful view," he agreed, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "But beauty can be deceiving, like a calm sea before a storm." She met his eyes, a flicker of challenge in her own. "And what storm do you foresee, Alessandro?" He turned to her then, his expression unreadable in the fading light. "The kind that comes when a powerful man falls. The kind that leaves chaos and uncertainty in its wake. And you believe I'm unprepared for this chaos?" He studied her for a long moment, his gaze intense, probing. She felt naked under his scrutiny, as if he could see straight through her carefully constructed defenses. "I believe," he said slowly, "that you are far more prepared than anyone realizes. But even the strongest ship can be sunk by a hidden reef." Bianca's lips curved into a small, knowing smile. "Perhaps. But I've been charting these waters for a long time, Alessandro. I know where the reefs lie." He inclined his head, a gesture of respect, perhaps even admiration. "I don't doubt that, Signora. But the question is, what course will you chart?" He paused, and his voice softened. Lorenzo, he was a hard man, a demanding man. He didn't say cruel. He didn't say brutal. He didn't need to. Bianca saw the unspoken words in his eyes, the shared understanding of the life she'd endured. He was, Bianca agreed, her voice devoid of emotion. The truth was, she felt nothing for Lorenzo. No grief, no sadness, not even hatred. Just a cold, empty space where a husband should have been. Alessandro took a step closer, his voice dropping to a near whisper. The scent of him was stronger now, intoxicating, dangerous. "Tell me, bella mia," he murmured, the endearment a spark in the gathering darkness. "Do you want justice or revenge?" The question hung in the air, heavy with unspoken implications. Justice would mean playing by the rules, navigating the intricate, often corrupt, channels of the mafia hierarchy. Revenge was a different beast altogether. It was a fire that could consume everything in its path, including her. Bianca looked at him, her gaze unwavering. The phantom was gone. In its place stood a woman reborn, a woman forged in the fires of a silent, suffocating marriage. A woman ready to claim her due. The faint sound of a car approaching, its headlights cutting through the dusk, was a subtle yet definite signal. Someone was arriving, and the game was about to begin. Chapter 2. Whispers in the Shadows. The approaching car was a sleek, black Maserati, its engine a low growl that resonated through the quiet evening. Bianca recognized it instantly. It belonged to Don Carlo Salieri, the head of the Salieri family, one of the most powerful and ruthless clans in the Sicilian underworld. Lorenzo and Carlo had been rivals, to put it mildly. Their relationship had been a complex dance of forced alliances, veiled threats, and simmering animosity. Alessandro's jaw tightened, almost imperceptibly. "Salieri," he muttered, more to himself than to Bianca. "He's early." Bianca didn't reply. She merely watched as the car pulled up to the front of the villa, the headlights illuminating the grand entrance. Two men emerged from the back, their faces grim, their movements precise and economical. Bodyguards, obviously. Then, Don Carlo himself stepped out. He was a man in his late 60s, but he carried himself with the air of a much younger man. His silver hair was impeccably styled, his suit tailored to perfection, and his eyes, even from this distance, glittered with a cold intelligence. He moved with a predatory grace, a silent testament to the power he wielded. Bianca felt a knot of tension tighten in her stomach, but she kept her expression carefully neutral. She knew that this meeting, this carefully orchestrated dance of power and diplomacy, would set the tone for the days, weeks, and months to come. Her future, her very survival, depended on how she played her cards. "Stay here," Alessandro said, his voice low and firm. "I'll greet him." Bianca was about to protest, to assert her right to be present, but then she saw the look in his eyes. It wasn't a dismissal, but a warning, a silent acknowledgement of the danger that Don Carlo represented. She nodded, a subtle understanding passing between them. Alessandro descended the grand staircase, his movements deliberate, his posture radiating controlled power. Bianca watched from the balcony, her senses on high alert. She could hear the murmur of voices, the polite greetings, the carefully worded exchanges that masked the underlying tension. She knew what Don Carlo wanted. He wanted to consolidate his power, to absorb the Marchesi empire into his own. He saw Lorenzo's death as an opportunity, a chance to eliminate a rival and expand his influence. He likely expected to find a weak, grieving widow, easily manipulated, easily controlled. He was in for a surprise. Bianca had spent the last 3 days not mourning but planning. She'd gone through Lorenzo's private papers, his hidden accounts, his secret correspondence. She'd unearthed a wealth of information, secrets that could be used as leverage, as weapons. She'd also discovered something else, something that had sent a chill down her spine. A betrayal. Lorenzo hadn't been killed by a rival family, as everyone assumed. He'd been betrayed from within. Someone in his own inner circle had orchestrated his assassination. The question was who?
And why?
The discovery had added another layer of complexity to an already dangerous situation. It meant that she couldn't trust anyone, not entirely. Even Alessandro, she pushed the thought aside. She couldn't afford to doubt him, not now. He was her only ally, the only one who seemed to understand the game she was playing. The murmur of voices grew louder, closer. Alessandro was leading Don Carlo and his men towards the study, Lorenzo's former sanctuary, a room filled with dark wood, leather-bound books, and the lingering scent of power. Bianca took a deep breath, steeling herself. She knew she couldn't stay hidden on the balcony forever. She had to face Don Carlo, to show him that she wasn't the weak, fragile widow he expected. She walked back into the villa, her footsteps echoing on the marble floors. The servants, sensing the shift in power, averted their eyes, their faces carefully blank. They knew better than to get involved in the affairs of their masters. As she approached the study, she could hear Don Carlo's voice, smooth and oily, laced with a subtle undercurrent of menace.
A tragedy, Alessandro, a terrible tragedy.
Lorenzo was a formidable man, but life goes on, and we must ensure a smooth transition, for the good of all. Bianca paused outside the closed door, her hand resting on the cool brass handle. She took one last deep breath, summoning all her strength, all her cunning. Then, she pushed the door open and stepped inside. The room fell silent. All eyes turned to her, assessing, judging. Don Carlo's gaze was particularly intense, his eyes narrowed, his expression unreadable. Alessandro stood beside him, his face impassive, but Bianca could sense the tension in his body. "Signora Marchesi," Don Carlo said, his voice dripping with false sympathy. "My deepest condolences. I understand this must be a difficult time for you." Bianca met his gaze, her own expression carefully composed. "Thank you, Don Carlo," she said, her voice clear and steady. "It is. But I am my husband's widow, and I intend to honor his memory by ensuring the stability of his legacy." The words hung in the air, a subtle challenge, a declaration of intent. Don Carlo's lips curved into a thin smile, a flicker of amusement in his eyes. "Indeed," he said. "And how do you propose to do that, Signora?" Bianca stepped further into the room, her movements deliberate, her gaze sweeping over the faces of the men present. She stopped in front of Don Carlo, her chin lifted, her eyes unwavering. The faint rustle of her silk dress was the only sound in the room, a whisper of defiance in the face of overwhelming power. The feeling was intoxicating. Chapter 3. The Enforcer's Gaze. "By taking my rightful place," Bianca replied, her voice calm and measured, yet carrying an undercurrent of steel that surprised even Alessandro. She saw the flicker of surprise, quickly masked, in Don Carlo's eyes. He hadn't expected this quiet strength, this blatant assertion of power. Don Carlo leaned back in his chair, a gesture of feigned relaxation, but his eyes remained sharp and watchful. "Your rightful place, Signora? And what place is that, pray tell?" "The place my husband held," Bianca said, without hesitation. the head of the Marchesi family. A murmur of disbelief rippled through the room. The two bodyguards shifted uneasily, their hands instinctively moving towards their concealed weapons. Alessandro remained motionless, his expression unreadable, but Bianca could feel his gaze on her, intense and unwavering. Don Carlo chuckled, a low, rumbling sound that lacked genuine humor. "My dear Signora, you are clearly distraught. The traditions of our world do not allow for a woman to lead a family." "Traditions can be changed, Don Carlo," Bianca countered, her voice unwavering. "Especially when circumstances demand it." "And what circumstances would those be?" he asked, his voice laced with a subtle threat. Bianca took a step closer, invading his personal space, a deliberate act of defiance. "The circumstance that my husband was betrayed, murdered by someone within his own ranks. The circumstance that I am the only one who knows the full extent of his business dealings. The circumstance that I am not a fool, Don Carlo. And I will not be treated as one." The silence in the room was absolute, broken only by the faint ticking of a grandfather clock in the corner. Don Carlo studied her, his eyes narrowed, his expression a mixture of surprise and grudging respect. He was realizing, perhaps for the first time, that he had underestimated her. "You have proof of this betrayal?" he asked, his voice softer now, more cautious. Bianca held his gaze. "I have enough. Enough to cause considerable disruption if I were to share it with the wrong people." It was a bluff, a calculated risk. She had suspicions, strong ones, but no concrete proof.
Yet.
But she knew that Don Carlo couldn't afford to call her bluff, not without knowing the full extent of what she knew. He steepled his fingers, his gaze shifting from Bianca to Alessandro, then back again. "And what is it you want, Signora Marchesi?" "I want what is rightfully mine," Bianca said.
Control of the Marchesi family.
"And I want the man who killed my husband brought to justice." "My justice." Don Carlo considered this for a moment, his eyes gleaming with a cold calculation. "And what makes you think you can handle such a responsibility?" "This is not a game for women, Signora. I've been playing this game my entire life, Don Carlo," Bianca replied, her voice laced with a hint of bitterness. "I've just been playing it from the shadows. Now, I'm stepping into the light." She turned her gaze to Alessandro, her eyes meeting his. There was a silent communication between them, a shared understanding that transcended words. She was asking for his support, his loyalty, his trust. It was a gamble, a dangerous one, but she had no other choice. Alessandro's gaze held hers, unwavering. He didn't speak, but she saw the answer in his eyes. A flicker of respect, of admiration, and something else. Something deeper, something that sent a shiver down her spine. He stepped forward, his voice calm and authoritative. "Don Carlo," he said, "with all due respect, the Signora is right. She is the only one who can hold the Marchesi family together. She knows the business, she knows the secrets, and she has the courage to lead." It was a bold move, a public declaration of his allegiance. It was also a risk. He was defying Don Carlo, challenging his authority, potentially putting his own life in danger. Don Carlo looked at Alessandro, his expression unreadable. The tension in the room was palpable, thick enough to cut with a knife. He was weighing his options, calculating the risks and rewards. Finally, he spoke, his voice slow and deliberate. "Very well, Signora Marchesi. I will consider your proposal. But know this. If you fail, if you prove to be incapable of handling this responsibility, I will not hesitate to step in. And I will show no mercy." "I understand, Don Carlo," Bianca said, her voice steady. "And I expect nothing less." The meeting ended shortly after, with a tense, uneasy truce. Don Carlo and his men departed, leaving Bianca and Alessandro alone in the study. The silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken emotions. Bianca felt drained, exhausted, but also exhilarated. She had taken the first step, the most dangerous step. She had challenged the established order, defied expectations, and survived. Alessandro walked over to the window, his back to her, his hands clasped behind him. He stood there for a long moment, staring out at the darkening sky. That was bold, he said finally, his voice low and rough, and incredibly reckless. Bianca joined him at the window, her gaze fixed on the same distant horizon. I had no choice. He turned to her, his eyes searching hers. You could have run. You could have disappeared. No one would have blamed you. And leave everything to them? Bianca shook her head.
No.
This is my life, my legacy. I won't let them take it from me. He studied her, his gaze intense, his expression a mixture of concern and admiration. The silence that had been a barrier between them for so long was now a bridge, a shared space of understanding and unspoken desires. He reached out, his hand gently touching her cheek, the warmth of his skin sending a jolt of electricity through her. The touch lingered, a silent promise of protection, a whispered acknowledgement of the dangerous path they were about to embark on together. The faint scent of rain on the wind hinted at the coming storm, both outside and within. Chapter 4. A Legacy of Silence. His touch, though fleeting, lingered on her skin, a brand of warmth in the cool, shadowed room. Bianca closed her eyes for a moment, savoring the sensation, the unexpected intimacy. It was a stark contrast to the cold indifference she'd grown accustomed to, the years of emotional starvation she'd endured. Alessandro withdrew his hand, the loss of contact leaving a sudden void. He stepped back, a subtle distance returning between them, a reminder of the roles they were playing, the dangerous game they were engaged in. You realize what you've done, he said, his voice low, his gaze still fixed on hers. You've declared war. Not just on Salieri, but on anyone who challenges your claim. I know, Bianca replied, her voice steady, betraying none of the fear that gnawed at her insides. And I'm prepared to fight. He studied her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Are you? Are you truly prepared for what's to come? This isn't a game, Bianca. This is life and death. She met his gaze, her chin lifted, her eyes unwavering. I've lived in the shadow of death my entire life, Alessandro. I'm not afraid of it anymore. He nodded, a flicker of respect in his eyes. I believe you. But fear isn't the enemy.
Complacency is.
Underestimation is. You can't afford to let your guard down. Not for a moment. I won't, she promised. And I won't be alone. She looked at him, her gaze searching his.
Will I?
The question hung in the air, heavy with unspoken meaning. It was a plea for his loyalty, his support, his trust. It was also an acknowledgement of the bond that had formed between them, the unspoken connection that had been simmering beneath the surface for years. Alessandro's gaze held hers, unwavering. He didn't speak, but she saw the answer in his eyes. A silent vow, a promise of allegiance. He would stand by her, protect her, fight for her. You won't be alone, he said finally, his voice a low rumble that sent a shiver down her spine. It wasn't just a promise, it was a commitment. A wave of relief washed over Bianca, a sense of gratitude, so profound it brought tears to her eyes. She'd been alone for so long, isolated in her gilded cage, that she'd forgotten what it felt like to have someone on her side, someone she could truly trust. Thank you, she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. He reached out, his hand gently wiping away a stray tear that traced a path down her cheek. The touch was tender, intimate, a stark contrast to the harsh realities of their world. We need a plan, he said, his voice regaining its usual firmness. Salieri won't wait long. He'll be looking for any weakness, any opportunity to strike. Bianca nodded, pulling herself together. She couldn't afford to be weak, not now. She had to be strong, ruthless, cunning. She had to be the leader her family needed, the woman Alessandro believed she could be. Lorenzo's files, she said. There are secrets in there, information that could be useful. We need to go through them carefully. I've already started, Alessandro said. But there's something else. Something you should know. He hesitated, his expression troubled. Bianca felt a knot of apprehension tighten in her stomach.
What is it?
She asked, her voice barely a whisper. There's a rumor, he said, his voice low and guarded. A whisper in the shadows. They say Lorenzo was planning to name you as his successor. Bianca stared at him, stunned. What? That's impossible. He would never have done that. He was a complicated man, Bianca, Alessandro said. He kept many secrets. And he was changing towards the end. He was becoming more unpredictable. Bianca struggled to process this information. It was a revelation, a game changer. If it was true, it meant that Lorenzo had, in his own twisted way, acknowledged her strength, her potential. It also meant that his betrayal had been even more profound, his murder even more calculated. We need to find proof, she said, her voice shaking slightly. If this is true, it changes everything. I agree, Alessandro said. But we need to be careful. Whoever killed Lorenzo won't hesitate to kill you, especially if they know you were his chosen heir. A chill ran down Bianca's spine. The danger was real, immediate and terrifying. But she wouldn't let fear paralyze her. She would fight. She would survive. She would avenge her husband's death, and she would claim her rightful place, not just as the head of the Marchesi family, but as a woman finally free to forge her own destiny. The weight of Lorenzo's legacy, a legacy built on silence and secrets, settled upon her shoulders. But beneath that weight, a new strength was beginning to emerge. A flicker of hope in the gathering darkness, and at its center the eyes that refused to look away. Chapter 5. The Weight of Unspoken Words. The study, once Lorenzo's domain, now felt like a battleground of shadows and secrets. The air was heavy with the scent of old leather and the lingering ghost of his presence. Bianca and Alessandro worked in a tense, focused silence, sifting through the mountains of documents, searching for any clue, any hint of the truth. Hours passed, marked only by the rhythmic ticking of the grandfather clock and the occasional rustle of paper. The silence was broken only by brief, whispered exchanges, questions, observations, deductions. Bianca found herself increasingly drawn to Alessandro's presence, his quiet strength, his unwavering focus. He was a stark contrast to Lorenzo, who had always dominated every room, every conversation, every interaction. Alessandro was a man of few words, but his silence was powerful, his gaze intense, his actions deliberate. She found herself studying him, observing the way he moved, the way he thought, the way he looked at her. There was a depth to his gaze that she'd never seen in any other man, a knowingness that both intrigued and unnerved her. He caught her looking, his eyes meeting hers. There was a question in his gaze, a silent inquiry. Bianca felt a blush rise to her cheeks, a warmth that spread through her body. She quickly looked away, pretending to be engrossed in a document, but she could feel his eyes still on her. Anything? He asked, his voice low, breaking the silence. Bianca shook her head. Nothing concrete. Just hints, whispers, innuendos. Lorenzo was a master of ambiguity. He liked to keep his options open, Alessandro agreed. He trusted no one completely. Except you, Bianca said, the words slipping out before she could stop them. Alessandro's gaze met hers again, his expression unreadable. He trusted my loyalty, he said. Not my heart. The words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken meaning. Bianca felt a flutter in her chest, a nervous anticipation. What was he saying? What did he mean? He turned away, breaking the eye contact, returning his attention to the documents. Bianca felt a pang of disappointment, a sense of frustration. She wanted to know more, to understand the secrets that lurked beneath his stoic exterior. Alessandro, she said, her voice hesitant.
What did you mean by that?
He paused, his back to her, his shoulders tense. He took a deep breath, then turned to face her, his expression guarded. Lorenzo knew I respected you, he said, his voice low and rough. He knew I saw something in you that others didn't. Something he feared.
Feared?
Bianca asked, confused. Why would he fear me? Because you were strong, Alessandro said. Because you were intelligent. Because you were a threat to his control. He took a step closer, his gaze intense, his voice dropping to a near whisper.
He knew I saw that.
And he knew I wouldn't let anyone hurt you. The air crackled with unspoken emotions. Bianca felt her heart pounding in her chest, Her breath caught in her throat. The unspoken words, the hidden desires, the forbidden attraction, it was all there, hanging between them, a tangible force. Suddenly, a loud crash from downstairs shattered the tense silence. Alessandro's hand instinctively went to the gun concealed beneath his jacket. He moved swiftly, silently, towards the door, his body alert, his senses on high alert. "Stay here," he ordered, his voice firm, his eyes filled with a fierce protectiveness. Bianca wanted to protest, to follow him, but she knew he was right. She was safer here in the study than out in the open, where she could be a target. She waited, her heart pounding, her ears straining for any sound. The silence was deafening, broken only by the frantic beating of her own heart. Then, she heard voices, muffled and indistinct, but definitely there. A struggle? A confrontation? She couldn't tell. She crept towards the door, her hand trembling as she reached for the handle. She had to know what was happening, who was down there. Just as she was about to open the door, she heard Alessandro's voice, calm and authoritative.
"It's all right," he said.
"It was just a misunderstanding. Everything is under control." Bianca let out a sigh of relief, her body slumping against the door. She felt weak, shaken, but also grateful. Grateful for Alessandro's presence, his protection, his unwavering loyalty. She opened and saw it was one of the house staff that had dropped a silver platter in the kitchen, far below. He apologized profusely, but the tension from the noise did not dissipate, the question he'd raised still echoing in the quiet of the study. Chapter 6. Echoes of Betrayal. The false alarm, though ultimately harmless, served as a stark reminder of the precariousness of their situation. The air in the study, already thick with tension, now felt even heavier, charged with a sense of impending danger. Alessandro returned, his expression grim, his eyes scanning the room as if searching for any hidden threats. He saw the fear in Bianca's eyes, the vulnerability she tried so hard to conceal. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice softer now, filled with concern. Bianca nodded, trying to regain her composure. "Yes, I am fine. Just a little shaken." He reached out, his hand gently touching her arm, the warmth of his touch a reassuring presence. "It's all right to be afraid, Bianca. But you can't let fear control you." She met his gaze, her eyes searching his. "I know. But it's not just the fear of what might happen. It's the uncertainty. Not knowing who to trust." He nodded, understanding. "Trust is a luxury we can't afford right now. But you can trust me." The words, spoken with such conviction, sent a wave of warmth through Bianca. She believed him. She wanted to believe him. "I do," she whispered, her voice barely audible. He held her gaze, his eyes filled with a depth of emotion that she couldn't quite decipher. It was more than just loyalty, more than just protectiveness. It was something deeper, something that resonated with her own hidden desires, her own unspoken longings. He withdrew his hand, the loss of contact leaving a sudden void. He stepped back, a subtle distance returning between them, a reminder of the roles they were playing, the dangerous game they were engaged in. "We need to get back to work," he said, his voice regaining its usual firmness. "We're running out of time." Bianca nodded, forcing herself to focus on the task at hand. They returned to the documents, but the atmosphere had shifted. The unspoken words, the lingering touch, the shared fear, it had all created a new dynamic between them, a bond forged in the crucible of danger and uncertainty. As they continued their search, Bianca stumbled upon a hidden compartment in Lorenzo's desk. It was a small, locked box, concealed behind a panel of intricately carved wood. "Alessandro," she said, her voice filled with excitement. "Look at this." He came over, his eyes widening as he saw the box. "He never mentioned this," he said, his voice low, his brow furrowed. They tried to open it, but it was locked. Alessandro retrieved a small set of tools from a drawer, his movements precise and efficient. He worked on the lock, his brow furrowed in concentration. Finally, with a click, the lock gave way. Bianca held her breath as Alessandro slowly opened the box. Inside, Nestled on a bed of velvet was a single document. It was a letter written in Lorenzo's distinctive handwriting and addressed to Bianca. Bianca's heart pounded in her chest as she reached for the letter, her hands trembling. She unfolded it, her eyes scanning the words, her mind racing. The letter was dated just a few weeks before Lorenzo's death. It was a confession of sorts. He admitted to his mistakes, his cruelties, his betrayals. He acknowledged Bianca's strength, her intelligence, her resilience. And then he revealed the truth. He had named her as his successor. He'd secretly amended his will, leaving everything to her, bypassing the traditional line of succession. He'd done it, he wrote, because he knew she was the only one who could protect his legacy, the only one who could navigate the treacherous waters of the mafia underworld. But there was more. He also revealed the identity of his betrayer, the man who had orchestrated his assassination. It was Marco Salieri, Don Carlo's son. Bianca gasped, her hand flying to her mouth.
Marco?
It was unbelievable, yet it made sense. Marco had always been ambitious, ruthless, hungry for power. He'd resented Lorenzo, chafed under his control. Alessandro took the letter from her, his eyes scanning the words, his expression hardening with each line. He read it quickly, his face a mask of barely controlled fury. Marco, he muttered, his voice filled with a cold rage. I should have known. Bianca felt a wave of nausea wash over her. The betrayal was so close, so personal. It was a violation, a knife twisting in her gut. The implications were enormous if word of Marco's treachery made it back to Don Carlo before they were ready. Their tentative truce would be shattered. The sudden, sharp ringing of Alessandro's phone cut through the silence, a jarring intrusion into their shattered world. He answered it, his voice terse, his eyes fixed on Bianca's. The conversation was short, cryptic, but the look on his face told her everything she needed to know. Something had happened. Something bad. Chapter 7. The Serpent's Kiss. Alessandro's face was a mask of barely controlled fury as he ended the call. He looked at Bianca, his eyes dark with a mixture of anger and concern. That was Rico, he said, referring to one of his most trusted men. Marco Salieri is dead. Bianca stared at him, stunned.
Dead? How?
He was found in his car, a single gunshot wound to the head. It looks like an execution. Bianca felt a chill run down her spine. Marco's death, so soon after Lorenzo's, and so soon after they discovered his betrayal, it couldn't be a coincidence. Who did it? She asked, her voice barely a whisper. Alessandro shook his head. Rico doesn't know. But it's clear someone is cleaning house. Someone is eliminating anyone who could threaten their power. The implications were terrifying. If Marco had been killed to silence him, to prevent him from revealing his role in Lorenzo's assassination, then Bianca was in even greater danger. She was the only one left who knew the truth, the only one who could expose the killer. It has to be Don Carlo, Bianca said, her voice shaking slightly. He must have found out about Marco's betrayal. Possibly, Alessandro said. Or it could be someone else. Someone we haven't even considered. The thought was chilling. It meant that they were surrounded by enemies, known and unknown. They couldn't trust anyone, not entirely. We need to disappear, Bianca said, her voice filled with a sudden urgency. We need to get out of here, before they come for us. Alessandro nodded, his mind already racing, formulating a plan. I have a safe house, he said. A place where no one will find us. We can go there, regroup, figure out our next move. And what about the letter? Bianca asked, gesturing to the document that lay on the desk. We can't just leave it here. Alessandro picked up the letter, his eyes scanning the words one last time.
We'll take it with us, he said.
It's our only leverage, our only proof. He carefully folded the letter and placed it in his inside jacket pocket, close to his heart. It was a symbolic gesture, a silent vow to protect the truth, to protect Bianca. They gathered a few essential belongings, moving quickly and silently. Bianca felt a pang of sadness as she looked around the study at the familiar objects, the remnants of her former life. It was all gone now, shattered by betrayal and violence. They left the villa through a back entrance, avoiding the main gate, and the watchful eyes of the guards. Alessandro had arranged for a car to be waiting for them, a nondescript sedan that wouldn't attract attention. They drove through the night, the city lights blurring into a stream of color. Bianca sat in the passenger seat, her eyes fixed on the road ahead, her mind racing. She felt a strange mixture of fear and exhilaration. She was running for her life, but she was also running towards something. Towards freedom, towards justice, towards a future she could finally control. Alessandro drove with a quiet intensity, his hands gripping the steering wheel, his eyes scanning the rear-view mirror. He was a man of action, a protector, a warrior. And Bianca knew, with a certainty that surprised even her, that she could trust him with her life. As they drove, Bianca couldn't help but think about Don Carlo. She'd played a dangerous game, challenging him, defying him. And now his son was dead. She knew he would be seeking revenge, that he would be coming for her. She glanced at Alessandro, his profile illuminated by the passing streetlights. He was her shield, her protector, her ally. But he was also something more. Something she couldn't quite define, something that stirred a longing within her, a desire she'd thought long dead. The safe house was located in a remote village, nestled in the hills overlooking the sea. It was a small, unassuming cottage, surrounded by olive groves and vineyards. It was a world away from the opulent villa, from the treacherous world of the mafia. As they stepped out of the car, Bianca breathed in the fresh, clean air, the scent of pine and sea salt. It was a moment of peace, a brief respite from the storm that raged around them. The only sign that this wasn't complete tranquility was a small, almost imperceptible scar above Alessandro's left eyebrow. She'd never noticed it before, but in this new, stark landscape it was an echo of the violence they were fleeing. A soft breeze carried the sound of distant church bells, a mournful sound that was both comforting and deeply unsettling. Chapter 8. Masks and Mirrors. The cottage was small, but comfortable. It had a rustic charm, with whitewashed walls, terracotta floors, and simple wooden furniture. There was a fireplace in the living room, a small kitchen, and 2 bedrooms. It was a place of refuge, a place where they could hide, heal, and plan their next move. Alessandro quickly secured the perimeter, checking the windows and doors, making sure they were safe. He moved with a quiet efficiency, his every action precise and deliberate. He was a man who was used to being in control, to protecting others. Bianca watched him, her heart filled with a mixture of gratitude and something else. Something she couldn't quite name, something that stirred a warmth within her, a longing she'd thought long dead. Once he was satisfied that they were secure, he turned to her, his expression softening. "It's not much," he said, gesturing around the cottage. "But it's safe." "It's perfect," Bianca replied, her voice sincere. "Thank you, Alessandro. For everything." He nodded, his eyes meeting hers. There was a depth of emotion in his gaze that she couldn't quite decipher. It was more than just gratitude, more than just loyalty. It was something deeper, something that resonated with her own hidden desires. They spent the evening in a tense, quiet silence. They ate a simple meal of bread, cheese, and olives, sharing a bottle of local wine. They talked, but their conversation was guarded, cautious. They were both aware of the danger that surrounded them, the uncertainty that lay ahead. As the night wore on, Bianca found herself increasingly drawn to Alessandro. She found herself studying him, observing the way he moved, the way he spoke, the way he looked at her. There was a strength in him, a quiet confidence, that she found both reassuring and alluring. She caught him looking at her, his eyes meeting hers. There was a question in his gaze, a silent inquiry. Bianca felt a blush rise to her cheeks, a warmth that spread through her body. She quickly looked away, pretending to be engrossed in her wine, but she could feel his eyes still on her. "Bianca," he said, his voice low, breaking the silence. She looked up, her heart pounding in her chest. "Yes." He hesitated, his expression troubled. "I need to tell you something." Bianca felt a knot of apprehension tighten in her stomach.
What was he going to say?
What secrets did he still hold? He took a deep breath, then spoke, his voice slow and deliberate. I was in love with Lorenzo's sister, Isabella. Bianca stared at him, stunned. This was the last thing she'd expected. Isabella? She repeated, her voice barely a whisper. Alessandro nodded, his gaze fixed on the floor. She died. Many years ago. It was an accident. A car crash.
Bianca remembered Isabella vaguely.
She'd been a beautiful, vibrant young woman, full of life and laughter. Her death had been a tragedy, a shock to everyone. I'm so sorry, Alessandro, Bianca said, her voice filled with genuine sympathy.
I didn't know.
He looked up, his eyes filled with a deep sadness.
It was a long time ago, he said. But it changed me.
It made me who I am.
Bianca understood.
Loss, grief, betrayal, they all left their mark. They shaped us, molded us, changed us in ways we could never imagine. I know what that's like, she said softly, thinking of her own losses, her own betrayals. He met her gaze, his eyes searching hers. There was a shared understanding between them, a connection forged in the crucible of pain and loss. He reached out, his hand gently touching her cheek, the warmth of his skin sending a jolt of electricity through her. The touch lingered, a silent promise of comfort, a whispered acknowledgement of a shared pain they carried. You remind me of her, he said, his voice barely a whisper. Your strength, your resilience, your spirit. Bianca's heart ached. She was a mirror, reflecting a lost love, a ghost of the past. But she was also something more. She was her own woman, with her own strength, her own desires. The moment stretched, and as Alessandro looked to pull his hand away, she reached up and captured it with her own, turning her face to press a soft kiss to his palm. It was a question and a promise, all in one. Chapter 9. The Price of Loyalty. The kiss, a fleeting moment of tenderness, hung in the air between them, a fragile bridge across the chasm of their shared pasts and uncertain future. Alessandro's eyes widened slightly, a flicker of surprise, then something deeper, something that mirrored the longing within her own heart. He didn't pull away. Instead, his fingers tightened around hers, his hand warm and strong. He looked at her, his gaze intense, searching, questioning. Bianca, he whispered, his voice rough with emotion. She met his gaze, her eyes unwavering. She didn't speak, she didn't need to. The answer was in her eyes, in the gentle pressure of her lips against his palm, in the silent yearning that had been building between them for so long. He leaned in, his face closer to hers, his breath warm on her skin. She could smell the faint scent of his cologne, the familiar, comforting aroma that had always been a subtle presence in her life. But just as their lips were about to meet, a sudden noise from outside shattered the moment. A dog barking, a car engine backfiring. Something it was enough to break the spell, to bring them crashing back to reality. Alessandro pulled back, his expression instantly shifting from tenderness to alert suspicion. He moved swiftly to the window, peering out into the darkness, his hand instinctively reaching for the gun concealed beneath his jacket.
What is it?
Bianca asked, her voice trembling slightly. I don't know, he said, his voice low and guarded.
Stay here.
He moved silently towards the door, his body tense, his senses on high alert. Bianca watched him, her heart pounding in her chest. The fear, the uncertainty, it was all back, crushing the fragile moment of intimacy they'd almost shared. She waited, her ears straining for any sound. The silence was deafening, broken only by the frantic beating of her own heart. Then, she heard a voice, muffled but distinct. It was Alessandro, speaking in Italian, his tone sharp, commanding. She crept towards the door, her hand trembling as she reached for the handle. She had to know what was happening, who was out there. Just as she was about to open the door, Alessandro returned, his expression grim.
It's Rico, he said.
He has news. Bianca felt a knot of apprehension tighten in her stomach. Rico's arrival, in the middle of the night, could only mean one thing. Trouble. Rico entered the cottage, his face pale and drawn. He was a young man, barely in his 20s, but he had the hardened eyes of someone who had seen too much violence, too much death. Alessandro, he said, his voice breathless. Don Carlo, he knows. He knows about the letter.
Bianca gasped. How?
Rico shook his head. I don't know. But he's furious. He's put a price on your head, Bianca. He's offering a fortune to anyone who can bring you to him. Bianca felt a wave of nausea wash over her. A price on her head. It was a death sentence. We need to leave, Alessandro said, his voice firm.
Now.
We can't stay here. But where can we go? Bianca asked, her voice filled with despair. He'll find us, eventually. Alessandro looked at Rico. The contact in Naples, he said. Is he still reliable?
Rico nodded. Yes.
But it will be dangerous. Don Carlo has eyes and ears everywhere. We have no choice, Alessandro said. We need to get Bianca out of Sicily. Out of Italy, if possible. They made their preparations quickly, gathering their few belongings, erasing any trace of their presence. Bianca felt a sense of overwhelming sadness, of loss. She was leaving everything behind, her home, her family, her life. As they were about to leave, Alessandro turned to her, his eyes filled with a deep concern. Bianca, he said, his voice low and earnest. I will protect you. I swear it. I won't let anything happen to you. She met his gaze, her eyes searching his. She saw the sincerity in his eyes, the unwavering loyalty, the love. I know, she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. He reached out, his hand gently cupping her face, his thumb tracing the curve of her cheek. It was a tender gesture, a silent promise of protection, a whispered acknowledgement of the bond that had formed between them. The escape, under the cover of darkness, had the bitter taste of defeat, but also the faintest glimmer of a new beginning, a life lived not in the shadows, but side by side, their hands intertwined. The price on her head was a heavy burden, but his loyalty was a heavier and far more precious weight. Chapter 10. A Dance with the Devil. The journey to Naples was a blur of tense silence and furtive glances. Alessandro drove with a focused intensity, his eyes constantly scanning the road, the rearview mirror, the shadows that seemed to dance along the edges of their vision. Bianca sat beside him, her body rigid with fear, her mind racing, trying to anticipate every possible threat, every potential betrayal. They arrived in Naples just before dawn, the city slowly awakening from its slumber. The streets were still relatively empty, the air thick with the scent of salt and exhaust fumes. Alessandro navigated the narrow, winding streets with a practiced ease, his knowledge of the city evident in every turn, every maneuver. Their contact, a man named Giovanni, was waiting for them in a small, nondescript apartment above a bustling fish market. Giovanni was a middle-aged man with a weathered face and shrewd eyes. He was a former associate of Lorenzo's, a man who had fallen out of favor with the Marchesi family but still retained a network of contacts and a deep understanding of the underworld's intricate workings. Alessandro, Giovanni greeted, his voice raspy, his eyes assessing Bianca with a mixture of curiosity and suspicion. It's been a long time. Too long, Giovanni, Alessandro replied, his voice guarded. We need your help. Giovanni nodded, his gaze shifting to Bianca. The Signora Marchesi, he said, his voice tinged with a hint of sarcasm. I've heard stories. They say you're causing quite a stir. Stories are often exaggerated, Giovanni, Bianca said, her voice calm and measured, despite the fear that gnawed at her insides. But I do need your assistance. Giovanni studied her for a moment, his eyes narrowed, his expression unreadable. He was weighing his options, calculating the risks and rewards. What do you need? He asked finally, his voice blunt. Passage out of Italy, Alessandro said. Somewhere safe. Somewhere Don Carlo won't find her. Giovanni chuckled, a dry, humorless sound. That's a tall order, Alessandro. Don Carlo has a long reach. And a lot of money. We're aware of the risks, Alessandro said. But we're willing to pay. Handsomely. Giovanni's eyes gleamed with a sudden interest. Money was always a powerful motivator, especially in the underworld. How handsomely? He asked, his voice softer now, more calculating. Alessandro named a figure, a substantial sum that made even Giovanni's eyebrows raise. "That's generous," Giovanni said, his voice betraying a hint of surprise. "Very generous. But it's still dangerous. Very dangerous." "We understand," Alessandro said. "But we have no other choice." Giovanni considered this for a moment, his gaze shifting between Alessandro and Bianca. He was assessing their desperation, their determination, their willingness to do whatever it took to survive. "All right," he said finally, his voice decisive. "I can arrange it, but it will take time. A few days, at least. And you'll have to stay hidden. I have a place, a safe house of sorts. It's not luxurious, but it's secure." "We appreciate it," Giovanni Alessandro said. "Anything is better than being hunted." Giovanni led them to another apartment, even more secluded than the first, hidden deep within the labyrinthine alleys of the old city. It was small, cramped, and sparsely furnished, but it had a solid door, barred windows, and a sense of anonymity. "Stay here," Giovanni instructed. "Don't go out. Don't talk to anyone. I'll be in touch." He left, leaving Bianca and Alessandro alone in the cramped apartment. The silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken emotions. Bianca felt a wave of exhaustion wash over her, a bone-deep weariness that made her want to curl up and disappear. She'd been running for days, fueled by adrenaline and fear. Now, finally, she had a moment to breathe, to think, to feel. Alessandro watched her, his eyes filled with concern. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice soft. Bianca nodded, trying to smile, but failing miserably. "Just tired," she whispered. He reached out, his hand gently touching her arm, the warmth of his touch a reassuring presence. "Rest," he said. "I'll keep watch." She wanted to protest, to insist that she was fine, but she couldn't. She was exhausted, both physically and emotionally. She leaned against him, her head resting on his shoulder, her body seeking the comfort of his presence. He wrapped his arm around her, holding her close, his body a shield against the dangers that lurked outside. She closed her eyes, inhaling the familiar scent of his cologne, the subtle aroma that had become synonymous with safety, with protection, with love. They stayed like that for a long time, wrapped in each other's arms, finding solace in the shared silence, in the unspoken connection that had grown between them. It was a dance with the devil, this alliance, this attraction, this forbidden love. But in the darkness of their hiding place, it was the only light they had. The muffled sounds of the city, the distant cries of vendors, the faint strains of music, all faded into the background, replaced by the steady rhythm of Alessandro's heartbeat, a comforting counterpoint to the frantic beating of her own. It was a temporary peace, a fragile illusion, but for now it was enough. Chapter 11. The Unveiling. The next few days were a strange mix of tense waiting and unexpected intimacy. Confined to the small apartment, Bianca and Alessandro were forced to confront the reality of their situation, the dangerous game they were playing, and the undeniable attraction that had blossomed between them. They spent their time talking, sharing stories, revealing secrets they'd kept hidden for years. Bianca learned more about Alessandro's past, his relationship with Isabella, his loyalty to Lorenzo, his disillusionment with the Mafia's brutal code. He, in turn, learned about Bianca's stifled childhood, her forced marriage, her silent rebellion, her yearning for freedom. They discovered a shared sense of humor, a mutual appreciation for simple pleasures, a common desire for a life beyond the violence and betrayal that had defined their existence. They laughed, they argued, they debated, they connected. The physical proximity, the constant awareness of each other's presence, heightened the tension between them. Every touch, every glance, every shared smile was charged with an unspoken electricity. They were dancing around the edges of desire, circling each other, drawn together by a force they couldn't deny, yet held back by fear, by uncertainty, by the precariousness of their situation. One evening, as they were sharing a simple meal of pasta and bread, Alessandro said, "I never thought I'd feel this way again." Bianca looked up, her heart pounding in her chest. "Feel what way?" He met her gaze, his eyes filled with a depth of emotion that she'd never seen before. Alive, he said, his voice low and rough. Hopeful. Like there's something worth fighting for. Bianca felt a lump form in her throat. She knew exactly what he meant. She felt it too. This unexpected connection, this fragile hope, it was a lifeline in a sea of despair. Me neither, she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. He reached across the small table, his hand covering hers, his touch sending a jolt of electricity through her. Their fingers intertwined, a silent acknowledgement of the bond that had formed between them. Bianca, he said, his voice hesitant. I don't know what the future holds, but I know that I care about you. Deeply. Bianca's heart soared. She'd longed to hear those words, to feel that connection for so long. I care about you too, Alessandro, she said, her voice trembling slightly. More than I ever thought possible. He leaned in, his face closer to hers, his breath warm on her skin. She could smell the faint scent of his cologne, the familiar, comforting aroma that had become synonymous with safety, with protection, with love. This time, there were no interruptions. This time, there was no hesitation. Their lips met, a tentative, hesitant kiss at first, then deepening, becoming more passionate, more urgent. It was a kiss that spoke of years of unspoken longing, of shared pain, of newfound hope. It was a kiss that sealed their fate, a kiss that bound them together, two souls intertwined in a dangerous dance of love and survival. The kiss ended, but the connection remained. They looked at each other, their eyes filled with a mixture of wonder and fear. They knew that this changed everything, that there was no going back. We need to be careful, Alessandro said, his voice rough with emotion. Don Carlo, he won't give up. He'll be looking for us. I know, Bianca said. But we'll face him together. He nodded, his eyes filled with a fierce determination. Together. Suddenly, a loud pounding on the door shattered the intimate moment. Alessandro instantly moved, his hand reaching for his gun, his body shielding Bianca's. Giovanni? He called out, his voice sharp, alert. There was no answer. Just another, more insistent pounding. Alessandro cautiously approached the door, his gun drawn, his eyes peering through the peephole. He froze. His expression changed from suspicion to shock. It's not Giovanni, he said, his voice barely a whisper. It's someone I never thought I'd see again. He looked back at Bianca, the expression in his eyes difficult to interpret. Disbelief was plain, but what else was masked within? He opened the door, and a ghost walked in. A ghost with Isabella's eyes. Chapter 12. Scars of the Past. Standing in the doorway was a woman who could have been Isabella's twin. The same dark hair, the same striking features, the same piercing blue eyes that Bianca remembered from so many years ago. But there was a difference. This woman was older, harder, her eyes filled with a weariness that Isabella had never possessed. Alessandro stared at her, speechless, his gun still clutched in his hand, but lowered, forgotten. He looked like he'd seen a ghost, his face pale, his body trembling. Isabella? He whispered, his voice choked with disbelief. The woman smiled, a sad, knowing smile. Not quite Alessandro, she said, but close. Bianca felt a wave of confusion wash over her. Who was this woman? And why did she look so much like Isabella? The woman stepped into the apartment, her gaze shifting to Bianca. You must be Bianca, she said, her voice surprisingly gentle. I've heard a lot about you. Bianca nodded, still struggling to process what was happening. Who are you? She asked, her voice hesitant. My name is Sophia, the woman said. And I'm Isabella's sister. Her twin sister. Bianca gasped. Isabella had a twin? No one had ever mentioned it. It was as if she'd been erased from history, a secret kept hidden for years. Alessandro finally found his voice, his expression a mixture of shock and relief. Sophia, he said, his voice still trembling. But how? We all thought we were told you were dead. Sophia's smile faded, replaced by a look of deep sadness. It was a lie, she said. A story concocted to protect me. To keep me safe. Safe from what? Bianca asked, her mind racing. Sophia's gaze shifted to Alessandro, her eyes filled with a mixture of anger and pain.
From the same thing that killed Isabella, she said. From the Marchesi family.
From Lorenzo. Bianca felt a chill run down her spine.
Lorenzo?
What had he done? Sophia explained, her voice filled with a bitterness that had clearly festered for years. She and Isabella had been inseparable, identical twins who shared everything. But their lives had taken different paths. Isabella had been drawn to the glamour and power of the mafia world, while Sophia had rejected it, choosing a life of simplicity and anonymity. When Isabella had fallen in love with Alessandro, Sophia had warned her, begged her to stay away from him, from the Marchesi family. But Isabella hadn't listened. She'd been too blinded by love, by the illusion of a fairy tale romance. Then, Isabella had discovered something, a secret that Lorenzo couldn't afford to let out. Something that had put her life in danger. She was going to expose him, Sophia said, her voice trembling with rage. She was going to tell the truth about his dealings. And he couldn't allow that. So he killed her? Bianca asked, her voice barely a whisper. Sophia nodded, tears welling up in her eyes. He staged it to look like an accident. A car crash. But I knew he was behind it. Alessandro stared at her, his face a mask of horror and disbelief. No, he said, his voice hoarse. I don't believe it. Lorenzo, he would, Sophia said, her voice filled with a cold certainty. He was capable of anything. And he knew that Isabella was a threat to his power. Sophia had been forced to flee, to disappear, to protect herself from Lorenzo's wrath. She'd lived in hiding for years, always looking over her shoulder, fearing for her life. But now that Lorenzo is dead, she said, and now that you, Bianca, are challenging his legacy, I knew I had to come forward. I had to tell the truth. The revelation was a bombshell, a shattering of everything Bianca had believed about her husband, about her marriage, about the world she'd inhabited. It was a betrayal that cut deeper than anything she'd ever imagined. Alessandro was devastated, his world turned upside down. The man he'd respected, the man he'd served loyally for years, had been a monster, a murderer. The woman he'd loved, the woman he'd mourned was dead because of that very same man. Bianca reached out to him, her hand gently touching his arm, offering a silent comfort. He looked at her, his eyes filled with a pain so profound it mirrored her own. The scars of the past, both visible and invisible, were suddenly raw and exposed, a gaping wound that threatened to consume them both. The arrival of Isabella's ghost in the form of Sophia's sudden appearance had shattered illusions and revealed the truth about the past and present, and there would be no going back. Chapter 13. The Heart's Reckoning. The weight of Sophia's revelation hung heavy in the air, a suffocating cloud of betrayal and grief. Alessandro was reeling, his world shattered, his beliefs shaken to their core. Bianca watched him, her heart aching for his pain, her own anger at Lorenzo's cruelty burning like a cold fire. They spent the rest of the night talking, piecing together the fragments of the past, trying to make sense of the tangled web of lies and deceit that had defined their lives. Sophia shared details of Isabella's life, her fears, her suspicions, her determination to expose Lorenzo's crimes. She also revealed her own struggles, her years of living in hiding, her constant fear of discovery. As the dawn approached, a fragile alliance began to form between the three of them. Bianca, the wronged widow seeking justice, Alessandro, the loyal enforcer grappling with betrayal, and Sophia, the avenging sister seeking closure. They were bound together by a shared pain, a common enemy, and a burning desire for truth and retribution. Alessandro, who had been silent for most of the night, finally spoke, his voice hoarse with emotion. I don't know what to believe anymore, he said. Everything I thought I knew, it's all a lie. Bianca reached out, her hand gently covering his, her touch offering a silent comfort. I know, she said softly. It's a lot to process. He looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of pain and gratitude. Thank you, he whispered. for being here, for understanding. Sophia, who had been watching them with a mixture of curiosity and hope, spoke up. We need to work together, she said. We need to find proof of Lorenzo's crimes. We need to expose him, even in death. But how? Bianca asked. Lorenzo was meticulous. He covered his tracks well. There must be something, Sophia said. Some evidence, some witness, some loose end. The letter, Alessandro said suddenly, his eyes widening. The letter from Lorenzo to Bianca. It mentioned a meeting. A meeting with someone who could corroborate his claims.
Bianca remembered.
The letter had been vague, cryptic, but it had hinted at a secret witness, someone who knew the truth about Lorenzo's dealings. We need to find that witness, she said. They could be the key to everything. But where do we start? Alessandro asked. Lorenzo was careful. He wouldn't have left any obvious clues. Sophia thought for a moment, her brow furrowed in concentration. Isabella used to talk about a villa, she said. A place outside of Palermo. A place where Lorenzo conducted his secret meetings. The Villa Rosa, Alessandro said, his eyes widening in recognition. I know the place, but it's heavily guarded. It would be impossible to get inside. Not impossible, Bianca said, her voice filled with a sudden determination.
Difficult, yes.
But not impossible.
We have to try.
They spent the next few hours planning, strategizing, preparing for what would undoubtedly be a dangerous and potentially deadly mission. They knew that they were walking into a trap, that Don Carlo would be waiting for them, that the odds were stacked against them. But they were driven by a force more powerful than fear. They were driven by a burning desire for justice, for revenge, for redemption. As they were about to leave, Alessandro turned to Bianca, his eyes filled with a deep emotion. He reached out, his hand gently cupping her face, his thumb tracing the curve of her cheek. Bianca, he said, his voice low and earnest. I know this is dangerous, but I promise you, I will protect you. I won't let anything happen to you. She met his gaze, her eyes searching his. She saw the sincerity in his eyes, the unwavering loyalty, the love. I know, she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. And I trust you. With my life. He leaned in, his lips brushing against hers, a fleeting kiss that spoke of 1,000 unspoken words. It was a promise, a vow, a declaration of love in the face of overwhelming danger. It was not a moment for grand passion. The reality of the past had taken its toll, and the dangers of the present were closing in. But it was a connection strengthened, a commitment made, a fragile hope blooming in the heart of their shared darkness. The reckoning, both internal and external, had begun, and they would face it together. Chapter 14. A Pact Forged in Darkness. The journey to Villa Rosa was tense and silent. Alessandro drove with a focused intensity, his eyes constantly scanning the road, the surroundings, anticipating any sign of danger. Bianca sat beside him, her body rigid with a mixture of fear and determination. Sophia, in the back seat, was a quiet presence, her thoughts and emotions masked by a stoic facade. They arrived at the villa under the cover of darkness. It was a sprawling estate, perched on a cliff overlooking the sea. The villa itself was a magnificent structure, built in the classic Sicilian style, with whitewashed walls, red-tiled roofs, and ornate balconies. But its beauty was deceptive, masking the darkness that lurked within. Alessandro parked the car a distance away, hidden among the trees. They approached the villa on foot, moving silently through the shadows, using the cover of the dense vegetation to conceal their approach. There are guards everywhere, Alessandro whispered, his eyes scanning the perimeter. We need to find a way to get inside, without being seen. There's a back entrance, Sophia said. Isabella told me about it. It's a service entrance used by the staff. It's less heavily guarded. They followed Sophia's lead, circling around the villa, avoiding the main gate and the watchful eyes of the guards. They found the back entrance, a small, unassuming door hidden behind a cluster of overgrown bushes. Alessandro cautiously tried the handle. It was locked. He pulled out a small set of tools, his movements precise and efficient. He worked on the lock, his brow furrowed in concentration. Finally, with a click, the lock gave way. Alessandro slowly opened the door, peering inside. The coast was clear. They slipped inside, finding themselves in a dimly lit corridor lined with storage rooms and utility closets. The air was thick with the scent of dust and cleaning supplies. "We need to find Lorenzo's office," Bianca whispered. "That's where he kept his most sensitive documents." "It's on the second floor," Alessandro said. At the end of the main hallway. They moved silently through the corridors, their footsteps echoing softly on the stone floors. They encountered no guards, but the tension was palpable, thick enough to cut with a knife. They reached the main hallway, a grand, opulent space, decorated with antique furniture, priceless paintings, and elaborate chandeliers. The silence was deafening, broken only by the faint ticking of a grandfather clock. They crept along the hallway, their hearts pounding in their chests, their senses on high alert. They reached Lorenzo's office, a large, imposing door made of dark wood. Alessandro tried the handle. It was locked, as expected. He pulled out his tools again, working on the lock with the same quiet efficiency. But this time it was different. This time, the lock wouldn't budge. It was more sophisticated, more secure than the one on the back entrance. "Damn it," Alessandro muttered, his frustration evident. "It's a custom lock. I can't pick it." Bianca felt a wave of despair wash over her. They'd come so far, risked so much, only to be stopped by a locked door. Suddenly, Sophia stepped forward, her eyes gleaming with a sudden determination. "Let me try," she said. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a small, intricately carved hairpin. It was an antique, a family heirloom, something Isabella had given her years ago. "Isabella taught me a few tricks," she said, a faint smile playing on her lips. She knelt down in front of the lock, her fingers working deftly, manipulating the hairpin with a skill that surprised both Bianca and Alessandro. Minutes passed, stretching into an eternity. The silence was broken only by the faint clicking of the hairpin against the metal of the lock. Finally, with a soft click, the lock gave way. Sophia stood up, her face flushed with triumph. "I told you," she said, a hint of pride in her voice. "Never underestimate a woman with a hairpin." Alessandro looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of admiration and relief. "You never cease to amaze me, Sophia," he said. They opened the door and stepped inside Lorenzo's office. It was a large, opulent room, filled with dark wood furniture, leather-bound books, and the lingering scent of cigars and expensive cologne. The room was a testament to Lorenzo's power, his wealth, his arrogance. They began their search, systematically going through the drawers, the cabinets, the shelves, looking for any clue, any evidence that could link Lorenzo to Isabella's death and his other crimes. They knew they were on borrowed time. It was Bianca who made the discovery. She found a hidden safe, concealed behind a large painting of the Sicilian countryside. The safe was old, heavy, and undoubtedly locked. But this time, they were prepared. Alessandro retrieved the small explosive device he'd brought just in case from his bag. It was a risky move, but they were running out of options and out of time. The pact they had made, forged in the darkness of their shared purpose, would hold. Chapter 15. Flames of Defiance. Alessandro carefully placed the small explosive device on the safe's door, his movements precise and deliberate. He was a man of action, a warrior, but he was also a man of caution. He knew that one wrong move could have disastrous consequences. "Stand back," he ordered, his voice low and firm. Bianca and Sophia retreated to the far corner of the room, their bodies tense with anticipation and fear. Alessandro connected the detonator, checking the wires, making sure everything was in place. He took a deep breath, then pressed the button. A small, sharp explosion rocked the room, sending a cloud of dust and debris into the air. The safe door swung open, revealing its contents. Bianca and Alessandro rushed forward, their eyes scanning the interior of the safe. It was filled with documents, stacks of cash, and a small, leather-bound journal. Bianca reached for the journal, her hands trembling. She opened it, her eyes scanning the pages, her mind racing. It was Lorenzo's personal journal, his private thoughts, his secret plans, his confessions. As she read, Bianca felt a wave of nausea wash over her. The journal was a chronicle of Lorenzo's cruelty, his ruthlessness, his utter disregard for human life. He wrote about his business dealings, his political connections, his enemies. And then she found it, a detailed account of Isabella's murder. He'd planned it meticulously, staging it to look like an accident, covering his tracks with a skill that was both chilling and impressive. He'd also written about his suspicions of Sophia, his fear that she would expose him. He'd ordered his men to find her, to silence her, but she'd vanished, disappearing into the shadows. Bianca felt a surge of anger, of hatred, so intense it made her tremble. This man, this monster, had been her husband. He'd lied to her, betrayed her, used her. Alessandro, who had been reading over her shoulder, let out a low growl, his fists clenched, his body radiating a barely controlled fury. "The bastard," he muttered, his voice filled with a cold rage.
He deserved to die.
Sophia, who had remained silent, watching them with a mixture of sadness and satisfaction, spoke up.
"We have what we need," she said.
"We have proof." "Not yet," Alessandro said. "There's something else." Lorenzo mentioned a witness. Someone who could corroborate his claims. They continued their search, going through the rest of the documents in the safe. They found evidence of Lorenzo's other crimes, his illegal arms deals, his money laundering schemes, his connections to corrupt politicians. And then they found it, a small, folded piece of paper, tucked inside an envelope. It was a name and an address. Antonio Bellini. Alessandro read aloud. "He lives in Rome." "He must be the witness," Bianca said. "The one Lorenzo mentioned in the letter." "We need to find him," Alessandro said. "He's our only hope of bringing Don Carlo down." They gathered the journal and the other documents, stuffing them into a bag. They knew they had to leave quickly before anyone discovered them. As they were about to exit the office, a sudden noise from the hallway made them freeze.
A voice, footsteps, approaching fast. "Guards,"
Alessandro whispered, his hand reaching for his gun. They must have heard the explosion. They were trapped. There was no way out, except through the hallway, where the guards were waiting. Bianca looked around the room, her eyes searching for an escape route, a hiding place, anything. Then she saw it. A large fireplace, dominating one wall of the office. It was old and used and big enough to hide them. "The fireplace," she whispered, pointing. "We can hide in there." It was a desperate plan, a long shot, but they had no other choice. They quickly extinguished the lights, plunging the room into darkness. They scrambled into the fireplace, squeezing together in the tight space, their bodies pressed close, their hearts pounding in their chests. The guards burst into the room, their flashlights cutting through the darkness, their voices loud and angry. "Search the room," one of them ordered. "They're here somewhere." Bianca held her breath, her body trembling, her eyes fixed on the narrow opening of the fireplace. She could hear the guards moving around the room, opening drawers, overturning furniture, their frustration growing with each passing moment. The flames of defiance, both literal and metaphorical, were all that separated them from capture. The heat was intense, the air thick with the smell of soot and smoke, but they dared not move. Chapter 16. The Shroud of Secrets. The guards searched the office meticulously, their flashlights probing every corner, every shadow. Bianca could feel Alessandro's body tense beside her, his hand gripping hers, his presence a silent reassurance in the suffocating darkness of the fireplace. Minutes stretched into an eternity. Bianca's lungs burned, her muscles ached, but she dared not move, dared not even breathe too loudly. The fear was a living thing, coiling around her, threatening to consume her. She could hear the guards' voices, their frustration growing with each passing moment. They were thorough, relentless, and they were getting closer. "Check the fireplace," one of them ordered. Bianca's heart leaped into her throat. This was it. They were about to be discovered. She closed her eyes, bracing herself for the inevitable. She could feel Alessandro's grip tighten on her hand, a silent promise of protection, a final act of defiance. A flashlight beam shone into the fireplace, momentarily blinding Bianca. She could hear the guard's breathing, his heavy footsteps, his confusion. "It's empty," he said, his voice laced with disappointment. "Just an old, unused fireplace." Bianca couldn't believe it. They hadn't been seen. They were safe for now. The guards continued their search, but their efforts were half-hearted, their enthusiasm waning. They'd found nothing, no sign of the intruders. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, they left, their footsteps receding down the hallway, their voices fading into the distance. Bianca and Alessandro remained huddled in the fireplace, their bodies trembling, their breaths coming in ragged gasps. They waited, listening, making sure the coast was clear. Finally, Alessandro whispered, "They're gone." They slowly crawled out of the fireplace, their clothes covered in soot, their faces streaked with dirt, their bodies aching. They were exhausted, shaken, but alive. "That was close," Bianca said, her voice trembling. "Too close," Alessandro agreed, his expression grim. "We need to get out of here.
Now."
They quickly gathered their belongings, the journal, the documents, the evidence they'd risked their lives to obtain. They left the office, moving silently through the corridors, their senses on high alert. They made it back to the car without incident, their escape as stealthy as their entry. Alessandro drove fast, pushing the car to its limits, putting as much distance as possible between them and the villa. As they drove, Bianca couldn't help but think about the close call, the near discovery. They'd been lucky, incredibly lucky. But luck wouldn't last forever. "We need to be more careful," she said. "We can't afford any more mistakes." "I know," Alessandro said. "Don Carlo will be expecting us. He'll have increased security, tightened his defenses." "We need to find Antonio Bellini," Bianca said. "He's our only hope." "We will," Alessandro said, his voice filled with a fierce determination. "I promise you we will." They drove in silence for a while, each lost in their own thoughts, their own fears, their own hopes. The shroud of secrets they'd been navigating was beginning to unravel, revealing a truth far more complex and dangerous than they'd ever imagined. The fireplace, a symbol of warmth and home, had become a temporary refuge, a hiding place from the flames of Don Carlo's wrath. The soot that covered them was a reminder of the darkness they'd faced, the risks they'd taken, the bond they'd forged. The shared experience had stripped away another layer, leaving them raw, vulnerable, and even more deeply connected. As the first rays of dawn began to paint the sky, they knew they couldn't rest. They had a witness to find, a truth to expose, and a reckoning to face. And they wouldn't face it alone. Chapter 17. Beneath the Surface. They arrived in Rome under the cloak of a new day, the city bustling with the energy of early risers and the lingering shadows of the night. The anonymity of the crowds was a welcome change from the isolated tension of their previous hideouts. Alessandro, ever vigilant, chose a small, nondescript hotel near the Termini station, a place where they could blend in with the constant flow of travelers. Once settled in their modest room, Bianca spread the documents from Lorenzo's safe across the small table. The weight of the journal, in particular, felt heavy in her hands. It was a tangible representation of the darkness she was fighting against, a testament to the cruelty and betrayal that had shaped her life. Alessandro watched her, his expression a mixture of concern and admiration. He knew the toll this was taking on her, the emotional burden she was carrying. "We'll find him, Bianca," he said, his voice soft but firm. "We'll find Antonio Bellini, and we'll make sure Don Carlo pays for what he's done." Bianca nodded, her gaze fixed on the journal. "I know," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "But what if he's not willing to talk? What if he's too afraid?" "We'll convince him," Alessandro said. "We'll offer him protection, money, whatever it takes. He's our only chance." They spent the morning researching Antonio Bellini, using the limited information they had from Lorenzo's files. They discovered that he was a former accountant, a man who had worked for Lorenzo for many years, handling his sensitive financial transactions. He'd disappeared suddenly, a few weeks before Lorenzo's death, and hadn't been seen since. "He's in hiding," Alessandro said. "He knows something, and he's afraid." "We need to find someone who knows him," Bianca said. "Someone who can lead us to him." They decided to split up, each pursuing different leads. Alessandro, with his underworld connections, would try to track down Bellini through his former associates. Bianca, using her own network of contacts, the women she'd met through years of forced social engagements, the wives and daughters of powerful men, would try to gather information through more discreet channels. Bianca spent the afternoon making phone calls, sending messages, meeting with contacts in carefully chosen, public locations. She played the role of the grieving widow, seeking information about her husband's affairs, subtly probing for any mention of Antonio Bellini. It was a delicate dance, a game of whispers and innuendos. She had to be careful, cautious, revealing just enough to gain their trust, but not enough to arouse suspicion. She met with a series of women, each one offering a piece of the puzzle, a fragment of information. She learned that Bellini had been a quiet, unassuming man, a meticulous accountant who had kept to himself. He'd been married, had a daughter, and had lived a seemingly ordinary life. But beneath the surface, there were hints of something more. Rumors of gambling debts, whispers of a secret affair, suggestions of a man living under pressure. Bianca finally got a break. She met with a woman named Clara, the wife of a prominent politician who had been a close associate of Lorenzo's. Clara was a shrewd, observant woman, and she'd always been sympathetic to Bianca's plight. "Antonio Bellini," Clara said, her voice low, her eyes filled with a mixture of pity and warning. "He was a good man, Bianca. But he was in over his head. He knew too much." "Do you know where he is?" Bianca asked, her voice trembling slightly. Clara hesitated, her gaze shifting around the crowded cafe, making sure they weren't being overheard. I heard a rumor," she said. "They say he's been hiding out with the Sisters of Santa Maria. In their convent, on the outskirts of the city." A convent. It was the last place Bianca had expected. But it made sense. It was a place of sanctuary, a place where no one would think to look for a man like Antonio Bellini. A place protected by faith and silence. The irony was not lost on her, as it mirrored her own past, but this convent held a secret she needed. This convent, and the man sheltered within. Chapter 18. The Gathering Storm. The convent of Santa Maria was a sprawling complex, surrounded by high walls and ancient olive groves. It was a place of peace, of tranquility, a world away from the violence and betrayal that had consumed Bianca's life. But beneath the serene surface, Bianca knew a storm was gathering. She and Alessandro arrived at the convent just before dusk, the setting sun casting long shadows across the weathered stone walls. They approached the main gate, a heavy wooden door reinforced with iron bars. Alessandro rang the bell, the sound echoing through the quiet evening air. After a moment, a small window in the door opened, and a nun's face appeared, her eyes questioning, her expression cautious. "Yes?" she asked, her voice soft but firm. "We need to speak with Mother Superior," Alessandro said, his voice polite but insistent. "It's a matter of great importance." The nun hesitated, her gaze shifting between Alessandro and Bianca. She was assessing them, judging their intentions, deciding whether to trust them. Finally, she nodded. "Wait here," she said. She closed the window, leaving Bianca and Alessandro standing outside the gate, their hearts pounding in their chests, their senses on high alert. Minutes stretched into an eternity. The silence was broken only by the chirping of crickets and the distant sound of church bells. Finally, the heavy wooden door creaked open and the nun reappeared. "Mother Superior will see you," she said. "Follow me." They followed the nun through a series of courtyards and cloisters, the air filled with the scent of incense and old stone. The convent was a labyrinth of corridors and rooms, a place of quiet contemplation and hidden secrets. They were led to a small, sparsely furnished room, where Mother Superior was waiting for them. She was an elderly woman, with a kind face and piercing eyes. She sat behind a simple wooden desk, her hands folded in her lap, her gaze fixed on Bianca and Alessandro. "I understand you have a matter of great importance to discuss," she said, her voice calm and measured. Bianca stepped forward, her voice trembling slightly. "Mother Superior," she said, "we're looking for a man named Antonio Bellini. We believe he's hiding here with your sisters." Mother Superior's expression didn't change, but Bianca saw a flicker of something in her eyes. Recognition? Fear? She couldn't tell. "And why do you believe this?" Mother Superior asked, her voice still calm. "We have information," Alessandro said. "Information that suggests Mr. Bellini is in danger, and that he sought refuge here." Mother Superior studied them for a long moment, her gaze intense, probing. She was weighing their words, assessing their sincerity, deciding whether to believe them. Finally, she spoke. "Antonio Bellini is under our protection," she said, her voice firm. "He came to us seeking sanctuary, and we granted it. He is a good man, a frightened man. He has done nothing wrong." "We know," Bianca said. "But he's a witness to something terrible. Something that could bring down a very powerful man and put his life in even greater danger," Mother Superior said. "We can protect him," Alessandro said. "We can offer him a new life, a new identity, far away from here." Mother Superior hesitated, her gaze shifting between Alessandro and Bianca. She was torn between her duty to protect the man under her care and her desire to see justice done. I need to speak with him," she said finally. "I need to hear his wishes." She left the room, leaving Bianca and Alessandro alone. The silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken emotions. "Do you think she'll let us see him?" Bianca asked, her voice barely a whisper. "I don't know," Alessandro said. "But we have to try. He's our only hope." After what seemed like an eternity, Mother Superior returned, her expression troubled. "Antonio has agreed to speak with you," she said. "But he's very afraid. Please, be gentle with him." They were led to another room, a small, private chapel, where Antonio Bellini was waiting for them. He was a thin, nervous man, with graying hair and haunted eyes. He sat in a pew, his hands clasped tightly in his lap, his body trembling. Bianca and Alessandro approached him slowly, cautiously, trying to put him at ease. "Mr. Bellini," Bianca said, her voice soft, reassuring. "We know who you are, and we know what you witnessed." Bellini's eyes widened in fear. He looked at Mother Superior, his gaze pleading. "It's all right, Antonio," Mother Superior said. "You can trust these people. They're here to help you." The storm, both internal and external, was about to break. The convent, a place of peace, was now the epicenter of a conflict that would determine their fates. Chapter 19. Blood and Redemption. Bellini looked at Bianca and Alessandro, his eyes filled with a mixture of fear and desperation. He was a man caught in a trap, a pawn in a deadly game. "I don't know what you're talking about," he stammered, his voice trembling. "We know about Lorenzo Marchesi," Alessandro said, his voice firm but gentle. "We know about his crimes. And we know you were a witness." Bellini's face paled. He looked away, his gaze fixed on the floor. I can't," he whispered. "He'll kill me. He'll kill my family." "Lorenzo is dead," Bianca said. "But his legacy lives on. Don Carlo Salieri is just as dangerous, just as ruthless." Bellini looked up, his eyes widening in surprise. "Dead?" he repeated. "Lorenzo is dead?" "Yes," Alessandro said. "And we have proof of his crimes. Proof that you can help us corroborate." Bellini hesitated, his mind racing, weighing his options. He was torn between his fear of Don Carlo and his desire to do what was right, to protect his family, to atone for his past. Finally, he spoke, his voice barely a whisper. "I saw it," he said. "I saw everything." He began to tell his story, his voice trembling at first, then gaining strength as he recounted the events of that fateful night. He'd been working late at Lorenzo's villa, preparing the financial records for a meeting. He'd overheard a conversation, an argument, between Lorenzo and Isabella. She was accusing him, Bellini said. She was threatening to expose him. She said she had proof of his illegal activities. Lorenzo had tried to silence her, to reason with her, but she'd refused. She'd been determined to tell the truth, to bring him down. He lost control, Bellini said, his voice choked with emotion. He hit her. And then he ordered his men to get rid of her. Bellini had witnessed the whole thing, hidden in the shadows, terrified for his own life. He'd seen Lorenzo's men take Isabella away, and he'd known, with a sickening certainty, that she was going to die. He'd fled, disappearing into the night, leaving everything behind. He'd been running ever since, hiding from Lorenzo, fearing for his life and the lives of his family. Bianca and Alessandro listened in silence, their hearts aching for the man's pain, their anger at Lorenzo's cruelty burning like a cold fire. "We need you to testify," Bianca said. "We need you to tell your story to the authorities." Bellini hesitated, his fear still evident. I don't know," he said. "It's too dangerous." "We can protect you," Alessandro said. "We can offer you a new identity, a new life, far away from here. And we will bring Don Carlo to justice," Bianca added, her voice filled with a fierce determination. Bellini looked at them, his eyes searching theirs. He saw the sincerity in their faces, the unwavering commitment, the hope. Finally, he nodded. "All right," he said, his voice still trembling, but filled with a newfound resolve. "I'll do it. I'll testify." A wave of relief washed over Bianca and Alessandro. They'd done it. They'd found their witness, the key to unlocking the truth, the weapon they needed to bring down Don Carlo. But their triumph was short-lived. Suddenly, the sound of shattering glass, followed by shouting and gunfire, erupted from outside the chapel. "They're here," Alessandro shouted, his hand reaching for his gun. "Don Carlo's men. They must have followed us." The convent, once a place of peace, was now a battlefield. Alessandro pushed Bianca and Bellini behind the altar, shielding them with his body. He exchanged fire with the attackers, his movements precise and efficient, his aim deadly. The nuns, caught in the crossfire, screamed and ran for cover. The chapel, once a sanctuary, was now a scene of chaos and violence. Bianca, armed with a small pistol Alessandro had given her earlier, fired back, her aim surprisingly steady, her hand not trembling. She was fighting for her life, for Alessandro's life, for Bellini's life, for justice. She saw one of Don Carlo's men go down. Sophia appeared from the shadows, armed with a rifle she must have retrieved from their car. The battle raged, the sound of gunfire echoing through the sacred space. Blood stained the ancient stones, a stark contrast to the peaceful serenity that had once reigned. It was a fight for survival, a clash between good and evil, a final reckoning between those who sought justice and those who clung to power. The scent of incense was now mingled with the acrid smell of gunpowder, a profane blend of the sacred and the violent. The convent's tranquility had been shattered, replaced by the harsh reality of the world they were fighting to change. Chapter 20. The final confrontation of hearts and loyalties. The firefight in the chapel was intense, brutal, and chaotic. Alessandro fought with a fierce determination, protecting Bianca and Bellini, his every move precise and deadly. Bianca, despite her fear, fought back, her aim surprisingly steady, her resolve unwavering. Sophia, a surprising force, moved like a shadow, her rifle shots finding their marks with chilling accuracy. But Don Carlo's men were numerous and well-armed. They were relentless, pushing forward, their numbers overwhelming. Alessandro was hit, a bullet grazing his arm, drawing a cry of pain from Bianca. He staggered, but kept fighting, his focus unwavering.
"Alessandro!"
Bianca screamed, her voice filled with terror. "I'm all right," he said, his voice strained.
"Stay down."
Bellini, huddled behind the altar, was trembling, his face pale with fear. He was a witness, not a fighter, and the violence was overwhelming. Suddenly, a figure emerged from the shadows, a man Bianca recognized instantly. Don Carlo Salieri. He stood at the entrance to the chapel, his face a mask of cold fury, his eyes fixed on Bianca. He held a gun in his hand, its barrel pointed directly at her. It ends here, Signora Marchesi, he said, his voice dripping with venom. You should have stayed out of it. You should have accepted your fate. Bianca met his gaze, her chin lifted, her eyes unwavering. I will never accept your cruelty, she said, her voice clear and strong. I will never bow to you. Don Carlo chuckled, a low, rumbling sound that lacked any genuine humor. You have courage, I'll give you that. But courage is not enough. You're outnumbered, outgunned. You have no chance. I have the truth, Bianca said. And the truth is a powerful weapon. Don Carlo's smile faded, replaced by a look of pure hatred. The truth dies with you, he said. He raised his gun, his finger tightening on the trigger. But before he could fire, a shot rang out. Don Carlo staggered, his eyes widening in surprise, his hand dropping the gun. He looked down at his chest, at the blood blossoming on his white shirt. He looked up, his gaze searching, questioning. Standing behind him, a smoking gun in her hand, was Sophia. Her face was a mask of cold fury, her eyes filled with a righteous anger. That was for Isabella, she said, her voice trembling with emotion. Don Carlo collapsed to the ground, his body lifeless, his reign of terror finally over. The remaining gunmen, seeing their leader fall, hesitated, their resolve wavering. Alessandro, taking advantage of their confusion, opened fire, taking down 2 more. Sophia shot another. The rest, outnumbered and outgunned, surrendered, dropping their weapons and raising their hands in defeat. The chapel fell silent, the only sound the ragged breathing of the survivors and the soft sobs of the nuns. Bianca rushed to Alessandro's side, her heart pounding in her chest.
Alessandro,
she cried, her hands trembling as she examined his wound. Are you all right? I'm fine, he said, his voice weak but steady. It's just a graze. Sophia approached them, her face pale but resolute. It's over, she said, her voice filled with a mixture of relief and sadness. Bellini, still trembling, emerged from behind the altar. He looked at Don Carlo's lifeless body, his eyes filled with a mixture of fear and awe. He's really dead, he whispered. Yes, Bianca said, her voice firm.
He's dead.
And we're free. The police arrived, alerted by the gunfire, and took the surviving gunmen into custody. The nuns, shaken but unharmed, tended to the wounded. The convent, once a place of peace, was now a crime scene, a testament to the violence that had erupted within its sacred walls. But it would heal, and it would recover. The authorities took statements, and after a tense few hours, it appeared they finally had the truth. As Bianca watched Alessandro being treated by the paramedics, she knew that their fight was far from over. They still had to testify, to expose Lorenzo's crimes, to bring his accomplices to justice. But they had won a major battle. They had defeated Don Carlo Salieri, the man who had threatened their lives, the man who had embodied the darkness they were fighting against. They had done it together. Bianca, the widow who had found her strength, Alessandro, the enforcer who had found his redemption, Sophia, the sister who had found her revenge, and Bellini, the witness who had found his courage. It was a final confrontation of hearts and loyalties, a bloody and violent climax to a long and arduous journey. But it was also a beginning. A new chapter, a new life, a new hope. The blood spilled on the chapel floor was a testament to the price of freedom, the cost of justice, and the enduring power of love and loyalty. The final confrontation had revealed the true depths of their characters, forging an unbreakable bond between them, a pact sealed in blood and redemption. Epilogue. The months that followed were a whirlwind of legal proceedings, media scrutiny, and personal healing. Bianca, Alessandro, Sophia, and Bellini testified before a grand jury, their evidence meticulously presented, their stories corroborated by the documents recovered from Lorenzo's safe and Sophia's unwavering testimony. The trial of Lorenzo's remaining associates was a public spectacle, a sensational expose of the mafia's deep-rooted corruption and brutality. Bianca, once the silent, obedient widow, became a symbol of defiance, a voice for the voiceless, a champion of justice. She handled the pressure with a grace and strength that surprised even herself. She was no longer the phantom in her own life. She was a force to be reckoned with. Alessandro, his arm healed but his heart still scarred, stood by her side, his loyalty unwavering, his love a silent, constant presence. He had shed the mantle of enforcer, embracing a new role as protector, not of a corrupt empire, but of the woman he loved and the truth they had fought so hard to reveal. Sophia, finally free from the shadow of her sister's death, found a measure of peace. She had avenged Isabella, exposed Lorenzo's crimes, and reclaimed her own life. She decided to stay in Italy, working with Bianca to establish a foundation to help victims of mafia violence, a legacy of hope born from the ashes of tragedy. Bellini, under witness protection, started a new life with his family, far away from the dangers of his past. He had found his courage, his voice, and his redemption. The Marchesi Empire crumbled, its assets seized, its power dismantled. The old order was shattered, replaced by a fragile hope for a new era, a future free from the grip of organized crime. It was a slow, arduous process, but the seeds of change had been sown. Bianca and Alessandro, their legal battles finally over, retreated to the small cottage in the hills overlooking the sea, the safe house that had become their sanctuary. They spent their days tending to the olive groves and vineyards, rebuilding their lives, piece by piece. The silence between them was no longer filled with unspoken fears and hidden desires, but with a quiet understanding, a deep connection forged in the crucible of shared danger and profound loss. One evening, as they sat on the porch, watching the sunset paint the sky in hues of orange and purple, Alessandro took Bianca's hand, his touch gentle, his gaze filled with a love that had endured the storm. "We did it, Bella mia," he said, his voice soft, his eyes reflecting the golden light of the setting sun. "We're free." Bianca leaned her head against his shoulder, her heart filled with a profound sense of peace. "Yes," she whispered. "We are." The scars of the past remained, etched on their hearts and souls, but they were no longer wounds. They were reminders of the battles they had fought, the challenges they had overcome, the love they had found. They had faced the darkness, confronted their demons, and emerged stronger, wiser, and more deeply connected than ever before. They had found justice, redemption, and, most importantly, they had found each other. The future was uncertain, but they would face it together, their hands intertwined, their hearts united, their love a beacon of hope in a world that had once seemed so bleak. The echoes of gunshots and screams had faded, replaced by the gentle murmur of the sea, the rustling of leaves, and the quiet whisper of love. The widow's revenge had been achieved, not with violence, but with truth, courage, and the unwavering bonds of loyalty and love. The end.